Hello everyone. For this week's tutorial, I will be discussing more advanced transforms, such as the warp tool or the cage transform. These work in a similar way to the basic transforms discussed last week, but instead of using a simple rectangle or parallelogram area, you can make much more sophisticated areas to transform. The first of these advanced transforms in GIMP is the warp transform. A good way to think about this is that it uses the distort filters according to a brush pattern, so it is sort of a combination of the drawing tools and filters to modify the image. The first option is a drop-down menu telling it which filter to use. The first option, Move Pixels, spreads the pixels around the screen. Sort of like the smudge tool. The second option, Grow Area, applies a lens to make the area bulge. Like so. The option after that, Shrink Area, does the opposite, i.e. pinches the area in. The next option, Swirl Clockwise, makes the image whirl in a clockwise direction. Just like Grow and Shrink areas are mirror opposites, the Swirl option also has a counterclockwise direction. The last two options are generic and affect all the other types of warping. In particular, these options are Erase Warping, which removes the effect, and Smooth Warping, which smoothens the effect, meaning that it will be less pronounced but not entirely removed. Because the warp transform uses brushes, you have the size option for the size of the brush, the hardness slider, which determines how pronounced the edges of the effect are, low hardness, maximum hardness. Strength, which determines how hard the effect is applied. Low strength means that it is subtle. While high strength means that it is very obvious. Spacing determines how far apart the edges are in a transformation, like so. Notice that the lower the spacing, the more edges there are, and the more closer they are together. Interpolation works the same way as in filters and determines how the pixels will transition or how they'll be smoothed out. Abyss policy is also familiar from filters, and it determines what will happen to the empty areas. You can checkmark whether to have a high quality preview, which will make it render slower, but will look more accurate, And you can also check mark whether to preview in real time. High quality preview on. High quality preview off. You can check whether to stroke during motion, which will allow you to move the cursor in stroke. And you can also check for it to apply the stroke periodically, which means that it will happen several times as you hold down the mouse in one spot. With periodically off, with periodically on. Note that with periodically on, there is a rate slider to determine how often it is applied as you hold down the mouse. The greater the rate, the quicker it happens. Like so. The last option is to create an animated warp, but we will not be covering that until we talk about animation in any later video. The next advanced transform is the perspective transform, which makes the image grow and shrink in direction to a horizon, much in the way you would draw perspective on paper. The first option is limiting the transformation to a certain type of object. You can choose to transform the entire layer, but only the one layer, the currently selected area out of the layer, a path, which we will not touch until next video discussing the pen tool, or the entire image with all layers at once being affected. You can choose whether the transformation will happen in a normal direction or a corrective direction, which means the opposite of the direction it would normally be in. Normal direction in action. Notice how it grows and shrinks with the cursor moving away from the center. Corrective direction in action. There is also an option to link, which will keep all the other handle points locked as you move one of them. Like with the warp transform, there is an interpolation method, and there is also clipping methods provided if your transformation happens to go off the screen. The adjust option adjusts the resolution of the image so that it fits the transformation. The clip option clips out all of the transformation that does not fit within the resolution of the image, rather than adjusting the image. The crop to result option will make the resolution of the image smaller if the transformation does not fit within the image. And the final option, crop with aspect, will attempt to keep the aspect ratio after cropping. You can determine whether to show a preview, and you're also given an opacity slider if you are in the normal direction, but strangely, not if you are in the corrective direction. Note that the opacity is only there for convenience. In the preview, it does not actually get applied once you do the transform. There are guides to help you visualize your transformation. The default option is no guides. But if you click on the drop-down menu, you will see the first option after is center lines, which give lines intersecting the center of the transformation. Rule of thirds, which divides your transformation into 3 sections by 3 sections. Rule of fifths, which does the same thing except it's 5 by 5 instead of 3 by 3. Golden sections, which has larger corners, a small center, and medium intermediate areas. Diagonal lines, which cuts it into big triangles, medium-sized rectangles, and a small center square. Number of lines, which is very much like rule of thirds and rule of fifths, but allows you to customize how much lines will cut across the image. The number is applied both vertically and horizontally, like so. Notice how the number is 2, so there's 2 vertical and 2 horizontal for a rule of thirds effect. And now there are 15. The final guide option is line spacing, which seems to work like the inverse of number of lines, i.e., the greater the number, the less lines there are. The last 2 options are constraint handles, which you can activate by holding the Shift key, and transform around the center rather than the handles, which you can activate by holding Control. You may have already noticed that there is a pop-up window for Transformation Matrix when you apply a transformation. But since the numbers for the matrix are calculated for you, you do not have to worry about them much. The Reset button resets the transformation to none, like so. The Readjust button attempts to move the handles in a rectangle or square shape around the center, like so. And finally, the Transform button applies the transformation. The next transformation is the Handle transform, which has mostly the same options as perspective, but has different checkboxes for the handles at the last option at the bottom. This is because it transforms entirely differently than how the perspective tool works. In particular, you can customize it to have 1, 2, 3, or 4 handles instead of having 4 handles always, the way perspective tool does. If you use one handle, it will move the image using that one handle. While with 2 handles, it will rotate and scale the image according to the direction of the path between the handles. Like so. Notice the direction of the distance determines the rotation angle, and the length of the distance determines the scaling. With 3 handles, you will get a perspective transform, and with 4 handles, you will get a sort of hyper-perspective transform, with the scaling being very, very large. If you select the Move mode or hold Shift, you will begin moving the points instead of transforming them. If you select the Remove mode or hold Control, you will be able to remove points you do not want. Just like with the perspective transform, a matrix pop-up will appear when you do a transformation. However, there's no readjust option, only reset or apply transform. The next option is the Unified Transform tool, which, similar to the Handle Transform tool, compacts multiple transformations into one option. Also, like the Handle transformation, it has the same first few options. The only thing that is different are the constraint checkboxes at the bottom. If you click on the image to transform it, you will see many points come up instead of only 4. The white diamonds are there to skew the image. The gray circles on the edges are there to scale the image. As the gray circles in the corners are. And the gray diamonds in the corners are there in the same way that they work in the perspective transform. There is also a crosshair looking circle, which determines the origin of the transformation. However, this origin, referred to as the pivot, will only be used if you hold Control, otherwise it will always use the original origin. Like so. When you hold Shift on this transform, all of the options will do slightly different things. In particular, the diamonds will now freehand skew it so that the proportions don't have to stay equal. The squares will now freehand scale. Although the diamonds don't seem to do anything new. You can also determine whether the pivot point should be used only for scale, shear, or perspective transforms, rather than all of them at once, using the checkboxes. You can also determine whether the pivot point should snap to the corners and center. And you can also determine whether to lock it in place so that way you will not be able to accidentally move it anywhere else. The transformation matrix that comes up here does have a readjust feature, which works similar to the perspective one, and that it makes the points try to move smoothly in a rectangular square fashion around the pivot point. The last and most complicated is the cage transform, which uses polygon paths to transform the image. Much like the warp transform, it will affect the entire area. There is no option to determine whether to select only layers or selections of layers. Once you click on the screen once, you will get your first point. And as you move your cursor on the screen, it will automatically draw a straight line for you to give you your next point as soon as you click. Notice how the newest point is square-shaped rather than circle-shaped. The square shape indicates that you will be able to move it. However, if you click on any of the circles, they will turn to square shapes as well. As you may be able to guess, the point that is the most farthest out will have the most impact on the scaling, and so the path will rotate in that direction. Like so. The only customizable option, besides moving the path points, is to fill the original position before you transformed it with a solid color, like so. As soon as you click on any other tool, the path will disappear because it will be formally applied. Because I've not gotten the full version of Photoshop reactivated yet, I am using an online equivalent called Photopea, spelled Photopea. You may recall from last week's tutorial how I said you can either click Edit and Transform for individual transforms, or have a free transform by hitting Ctrl and T on Photoshop. This still holds for the more advanced transforms as well. Photoshop shares the perspective transform with GIMP, but besides that, the advanced transforms are very different between the two. And even then, the Photoshop perspective works very differently from the GIMP perspective. In particular, whereas the GIMP perspective was more freehand, the Photoshop perspective automatically snaps the selection to a trapezoid shape, so one side will be straight, larger, and the other side will be straight, but smaller. Like so. The distort transform, however, works the same way as GIMP's perspective transform, i.e., it fixes all the other points but lets you move one. Like so. Similar to the perspective transform, the Photoshop warp transform works very differently from the GIMP warp transform. In particular, you will see 4 new control points in the center, in addition to the control points from the other transformation options. Dragging the control points in the center will allow you to determine the general direction of the warping, and dragging the control points on the corners or edges will apply the warping to whichever circle you drag. Like so. Notice how there is no interpolation method or abyss policy for this warp transform, and neither is there an interpolation method or clipping method for the distort transform. Holding Control as you access the free transform will allow you to distort the image. Like so. And holding Alt as you drag the image will allow you to reference the center. Finally, holding Shift as you free transform will keep the proportions equal for scaling, and keep it in constant intervals for rotating. The last Photoshop transform, Liquify, works very similar to GIMP's warp tool. However, it is stored under filters rather than edit transform. Like so. Now that we have gone over all of the advanced transforms, Join me in next week's tutorial where we will discuss vector graphics and the pen tool. Because even though we have been working with vectors to transform the images, we have not used full-blown vector graphics just yet, as we have been transforming images that were made with raster graphics.
Don't forget to subscribe if you found this video informative, and make sure to visit the other tutorial videos and follow me on either Facebook or Twitter for more content.